But we talked about this a little bit on a previous episode about how we outsource so many of the things to Uber to give us a ride to the airport, the things that we used to rely on the community for.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that is also part of it, right? It's this sense that you're supposed to do all this stuff on your own. You're so strong. You don't need anybody else, but you have to be willing to give up that feeling and rely on the goodness of others. And I'm so glad that you pointed out too that that's what this show does, is that we are two people not only modeling it in person, but we have disagreements. We don't always agree on everything. We're not just reinforcing each other's ideas. We've been in some uncomfortable spots and had to sit with, like, oops.
Most conversations about connection tell you what to think. But are easy answers ever enough? I'm Keith Richardson. With my co-host Gerren Taylor, this is More in Common. Honest conversations about what keeps us apart and what doesn't have to. Come think with us.
I'm feeling like a lot of
Gerren,
tension in my upper
yeah,
upper back.
you look so similar to the last 2 weeks.
Is this a call
Shall we
out?
break the fourth wall?
Don't be calling me out on my lack of outfit changes, okay? Only 18 people average watch us on YouTube per week. So go watch us on YouTube.
Nah,
This is
on
the More in
YouTube.
Common
Yeah,
podcast.
that's true.
I'm
More
Gerren
people
Taylor.
listen to us. They don't need to see it. Yeah.
That's Keith Richardson. No, I didn't change clothes, and we are breaking the fourth wall. Now that you know how buildings work and I have four walls, I'm just sorry. That was funny from the other episode. If you haven't been paying attention to the past couple of weeks, we are doing a 3-episode arc about the cost of independence. In the first episode, we were talking about the actual trade that was made for our independence, our hyper independence that we experience now. And last week, we talked about what we lost. And this week, Keith, the question is, can we buy it back?
I mean, what do you think?
Well, I'm going to go ahead.
What's your hypothesis here?
I'm going to go ahead and start off with this is not supposed to be an episode of solutions. We're going to talk about the things that we can try to do to rebuild community. But the answer isn't just individual choice or structural reform. It's yes and both, or, it's really examining what we actually would require to do it and seeing if we're willing to identify it and say it out loud, right? I think the honest answer is maybe. Maybe we can't.
Yeah,
You
I
definitely
mean,
can't
I
buy
would.
it back through just like simple initiatives. It is about long term. It's not going to be apps. It's not going to be a new social media network that we need. It's not going to be AI. Right? Like those aren't the answers to this. It has to be admitting that we need to work on it and then figuring out what that actually looks like.
Yeah, and I think solutions are never easy, and I think so many solutions anchor on structural shifts. How do I build community? How do I build a movement? How do I do that? Um, but as we talked about 2 weeks ago, relative to hyper individualism, there has to be an additional shift in each of us in our capacity for what community really is. There is a researcher. His name is Bellah. What is his last name? I can't. He wrote Habits of the Heart back in 1985, and one of his meaningful claims was that we have changed our deepest commitments through language in what do I owe to is this meaningful to me? And I think a lot about my personal journey as we've recorded these episodes. I grew up an only child, and I grew up in New Hampshire. Live free or die is the sentiment.
Damn, is
Um,
that on the nose or
that's our
what?
that's our that's our That's our state motto. And, community, I never felt it. That in part there's family dynamic issues. My mom was one of 8, and that was my biggest community that I grew up in. My cousins were my siblings, and they all moved away. And I played baseball, but I was never a jock. I was also never a nerd because I didn't want to be one, always trying to find where you fit in. And I didn't get a lot of forced community like we talked about last week, right? I didn't do a lot of forced, I didn't go to church. There wasn't a lot of forced effort to be around other people, which ultimately allowed me the freedom to do what made sense for me. And I ended up moving away to Indiana to go to Purdue. And quite frankly, that's where I had one of the deepest integrated communities that I've ever been a part of, and my friends at Purdue. The individual value each person brought to that group was very, very present. The shared collective interests, we built teams together, we went to parties together, we played Madden together, we did all the things together. But then come graduation, I was like, well, I gotta go. Right. I followed a girl to New York. That relationship lasted 3 months. And I will tell you, as professionally and individually, how much value that provided to me in my life, where I ended up in Chicago and I ended up working a really good job that ended up setting me up financially for my family that I have today. I have always been searching for the right community, but didn't know how to engage in it. I always engaged in my communities, my baseball teams or whatever, individually, right? I'm going to go to the game, and then I am not going to go to drinks afterwards because I didn't want to drink. I had laundry to do. And it materially impacted me even to this day in how I like navigate community up until the last couple of years, where I have made an intentional effort to change how I see myself
Boom.
in relation to community, how
Kobe.
I value local relationships, how I can see where I navigate and fit in. And a big part of that is, quite frankly, my wife, who is on the extreme end of extreme ends of extroversion and needs people around all the time. And it's allowed me to really explore like who I am relative to other people rather than just who I am.
You just oof.
And
I
go
just think you
ahead.
just hit the
What was
nail
your
on the head so much about why we can't buy it back. And as I think about it, this is the throughput not only of, the last 3 episodes, but in some ways of what we've been talking on this show about for a couple of years. The identity protective cognition episode, trust collapse, the cost of being right. They're all connected because ultimately the 50 years, the experiment that we've been talking about hyper individuality affects how we see ourselves. It affects our identities. At the core, it is our identity. And you said it right there. Until I made an intentional effort to identify myself as somebody who wanted to create more community, it didn't happen for me. And that's the thing. All the standard community conversations are like, well, if we need more intergenerational connections, let's make more Big Brother programs, or like, let's make intentional programs for teens to hang out with elders, or let's make third places so that there are more community spaces. You can build all the things, you can make all the programs in the world, but until the basic identity of the person says, I am better with the group than I am by myself, the people aren't going to participate, right? The willingness to be interdependent, to count on one another, to show up for one another is something that we've ground down systemically through the push toward hyper individualism. And I really do want to circle back to the, because this is what that identity protective cognition thing is. Hyper
Mm.
individualism isn't just a political philosophy thrown out by Ayn Rand from Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, as we said in the first episode. It's now the load bearing identity for a lot of Americans.
Mm.
And who are you without the hyper individualistic, I can do it by myself, I've got it, I, me, mine, you know, greed is good as long as my people are taken care of, fuck everybody else mentality that we see run rampant. It
Oh,
just doesn't, it
you
just
bring
isn't.
like, and you bring up like this is the challenge I have, and it's the challenge in this effort is that it's not just structural. It is individual. Like we have to build our capacity for what do I owe versus what is good for me. Right? Like we as individuals, because the challenge is like, oh, I can build community and I can be a catalyst for all of these people, but they're not necessarily on that same path. They're still stuck in that institutionalization of hyper individualism. So I go to work, I do that. And what you find when you bring people together, people walk away going, oh my God, I'm so glad I had that. But it's not like we talked about last week, the weekly cookout, right? This is a bringing people together periodically based on schedules because we all have these crazy schedules and we have kids and we have this and we have that. And we're not necessarily bringing kids together with grandparents, with friends, and having these. So these are some of the things that we try to do. Where like we'll have our friends over with their kids, our parents, and we mix and mingle but it's not a regular thing. And it's not a regular thing because the structures around each individual don't allow for it to be a regular thing, especially when proximity is isn't next door,
Boom.
right? If
And that's exactly
right?
where I was going to go next, because that's one of the number one things that I believe the research, and the research I did for this episode, is that it shows proximity matters more than intention. You can intend up the wazoo, but if you're not near each other, even though you have shared interests or values, like it's hard to repeat. You know what I mean? It's just, it's that other thing. And when you were talking about your experience at Indiana, at Purdue, what is that? Right? It's default community, your dorm hall mates, the people you're in class with. You don't get to choose them. They're there. They're just there
It's
all the time.
they're there. And some of the other things like shared need, right? Timing matters, proximity matters, and shared stage of life matters, right?
But repeated
Like,
unplanned contact is the precondition for deep friendships. That person
mm,
that you can just call up and be like, "What are you doing? Let's go,"
yeah,
you know?
totally.
"Let's go
And
play
everything's
Madden,"
so
like you're saying,
scheduled
like,
now. You have all these like I had a friend over a couple weeks ago. I was like, dude, we just need to sit down and play Madden. And he came over. We played we didn't play Madden, we played FIFA instead for like
mm,
3.5 hours. And it was just this incredible experience that I have not had since college,
that's
right?
beautiful, dude. Like, I really am happy for
Right?
you.
Like, but we all, in order to really bridge this gap to what community could be, right? Because we do need to reconcile. It doesn't need to be closed off. It doesn't need to be walled. We do need to individually accept spaces where people might misjudge you, misconceive your intentions, because we need to learn to navigate and work through those. There is going to be judgment. We can't get rid of it, but how do we collectively understand how to navigate and work towards it without expectations? And so it's not just a structural problem. It is an individual effort, right? How can we set things that are obligatory? Like,
Mm.
guys, you cannot miss this every week without falling into this trap of, I don't feel like going.
Well,
Today's
see,
not my day.
that's the thing about the example I pointed out last week about DTLA First Sundays. It's the first Sunday. They take 1 or 2 off a year for holidays, you know what I mean, to be with, like, family, like, if it falls on New Year's Day or something, stuff like that. But it's always the first Sunday, and so that you can kinda count on that regularity, and not everybody shows up to every one of them, right, except for the host, but not everybody can make it to every one of them, but knowing that it exists on the first Sunday all the time is kind of where, you know what I mean? It's where that can happen, and that's why it's not about apps, and it's not about one-off events. It's really about kinda trying to create the physical and social conditions for accidental interactions to happen over and over again, right? That's why I make the example about the train, bumping into somebody on the train in New York on the subway, like, that is a place where those accidental interactions can happen over and over again, but when you're in the suburbs, and you're on sprawl, right? Physical proximity and repeated contact are a lot harder. The suburbs are militantly against you running into your neighbor. That's what the fucking hedges are for, right? And the fences are for, right? And the car dependency militates against it. Like I said, you go from your driveway at home to your parking space at work and back. There's no opportunity unless you're having some sort of road rage moment with another
Yeah, but
driver.
also shaping how those interactions and our expectations, right? Like we think about some of the language use going back to Bella's research and the language that we use that we accept. Oh, my neighbor's outside. I don't want to talk to them right now. Versus my neighbor's outside. Hey, I have just a second to say hello. I just wanted to say hi. I don't have time to chat. If they might be a gabby neighbor, but
Yeah.
the level of ability to communicate honestly in these spaces and continue to build that resilience. This is a part of the reason why, and people say get involved locally. Don't get so involved nationally. It's it's hard, but get involved locally. Build your community one person at a time, recognizing the thing that we said at the end of last episode is this is a generational project that requires both individual and collective commitment. We're two guys talking about it to start the movement to build it one person at a time, one community at a time, knowing that look, I hope my kids see what we do here and are able to then build upon it, right? Like one of the things people laugh at me locally that I have bought at charity auctions is my kids to be superintendent for the day. So basically, they go around to all the schools with the superintendent. They get this little badge, and they 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 go about and do all the things. They get to be the boss for the day around the school
Right.
district,
I
which
was
is a
principal
really
for the
cool
day, so I'm
experience.
familiar with the concept.
Yeah. So what they what I found is so my youngest just did this recently, and I went to the school to volunteer, and the person behind the desk who I know because I volunteer at the school, they're not a deep personal friend, but we know each other, we're familiar. And she goes, your daughter was superintendent for the day. Oh, she was great, right? Like it builds these
Right.
moments of of connection and community that when someone needs something, it's like that familiarity breeds compassion.
I think that there's a
And
couple of things that I wanted to touch on too before we get too deep on this because I don't want to forget. But we talked about this a little bit on a previous episode about how we outsource so many of the things to Uber to give us a ride to the airport, the things that we used to rely on the community
yeah,
for. And
yeah.
so that is also part of it, right? It's this sense that you're supposed to do all this stuff on your own. You're so strong. You don't need anybody else, but you have to be willing to give up that feeling and rely on the goodness of others. And I'm so glad that you pointed out too that that's what this show does is that we are two people not only modeling it in person, but we have disagreements. We don't always agree on everything. We're not just reinforcing each other's ideas. We've been in some uncomfortable spots and had to sit with like, oops, like, you know what I mean? Like, how does this shake out? But that's where the growth is, right? We have to be able to let go and go to a space that's not controlled and be changed by the exchange rather than just letting it affirm what we already
So, as I was preparing for this, and I typically don't read, but there's an element of suggestion that dovetails so beautifully off of what you said that I can't avoid reading it. But as we think about hyper individualism, which is this element of the strongest person is the most self sufficient one, right? To reframe it into the one who can need, let that need show and let people meet that need is one of the hardest shifts to community that is what you're saying. It's we have the tendency to what is it? Over or underestimate other people's willingness to help, right? And then overestimate our need to reciprocate that help. And if we can train ourselves instead of refusing help because I can do it myself and insist that we're fine and that my needs are invisible to you, if I can expose that and accept your help, like people that breeds it. And then it creates social capital, social connection. It's not transactional reciprocation, it's relationship reciprocation. That person helped me that time. I'm going to help them because they were really helpful and it creates an ongoing dovetail, but it requires us to shift away from this hyper self-sufficiency that says I don't need help from anybody, and these are the individual things that take a lot of work, effort,
Yeah.
and intention, but they're required just the same as creating a Sunday cookout in your neighborhood. You can create a Sunday cookout in your neighborhood where everybody just stands around and plays cornhole, but doesn't actually talk about anything.
Right, and there's no trust in there, right, right.
And
And
there's
that's
no
the thing.
trust built.
The hardest thing about this and why there's no easy solution is because it takes us admitting that independence is not the highest human value. Interdependence is. It's what you were just saying toward the end of the last episode, right? Like we are wired to need each other. It is part of who we are as human beings. It's not a weakness. It is a condition of humanity, and this version of freedom that been sold about not needing anybody else and being free from the encumbrances of everybody else is actually a very lonely kind of freedom, and I think that's on
Very
purpose. I
lonely.
think that's not an accident. I think that it is an isolating, lonely kind of freedom because you isolated and not having the interdependence or a system makes it harder to push back and makes it harder to fight back against the things that you want to see changed or the values that you would want to see changed and reflected in your society. And, I mean, for me personally, like, I think I went through some of that identity changing. Like I've always, like I said, tried to describe myself as someone who builds community and tries. But admittedly, part of the reason why I'm a divorced dad living in a foreign country by himself is my own reflection of hyper independence and feeling like I could do this. Um, and it is fucking lonely sometimes, to be honest with you, even with the community that I have built here. Um, but it doesn't replace certain parts that were exchanged for me to realize my own hyper individualistic dream of thinking that I didn't, you know what I mean? Not that I didn't need anybody, but that I could do this other
But
big
I mean,
thing on my own.
when we think about something, I'm surprised with this didn't come up 2 weeks ago. Is this fundamental meritocratic mindset in America that, okay, we can say pull ourselves up from the bootstraps, but how often do we hear, "I did it by myself?"
Right.
And there's value in that, when in reality, no one can do anything by themselves when you unpack it. It's the acceptance that I didn't do it by myself. And I think there's an important pivot in this. Just because you didn't do it by yourself doesn't diminish your individualism.
Mm.
It doesn't diminish your individual place among other people. In fact, I would argue it strengthens it.
I mean,
And
and you're right.
because
I think that I mean, ultimately, it is a values shift. It's not just a policy shift, but it is kind of reflected in policy, right? Like everybody hates socialism until it comes to the fire department, and that's part of the reason why is because as capitalism and hyper individualism go hand in hand, right? We can't pretend like that's not a thing that's happening. And part of the reason that it was first fueled as economic freedom and then it became like a moral obligation to only worry about yourself and not worry about
Yeah,
others.
so I,
And that trickles
you know,
across other things.
it's funny, and I will argue, and I think part of it really comes down to the language, and I'll argue because there is a vilification of capitalism. And I was talking to a friend of mine about it earlier today. Really, I think trying to get my head around some of these things, and I was sharing some of the ideas that we were going to record about, and he's like, "You're describing capitalism." At its core, capitalism is the emergence of value that one has to contribute to their social ecosystem. So when you think about the basics of capitalism, it is a grocery store on the corner competing with a grocery store across the in another neighborhood. But also, we talked about this, you have the electronics store and you have all of these individual capacities to do the best in that particular thing that allow for the emergence of resource generation throughout the community. And there
Right.
is some competition. That competition lets prices maintain lower, maintain accessibility for people and all these other things. But modern capitalism is built on a consolidation structure that says, let's just go to one place where someone provides resources from afar and allows me to just get all of those things rather than getting to know, like the example that you used, the person that shifted jobs and still knows you because in their
Well,
community, in the community.
so this is the critique, and I think that it's important to put the definitions in and treat the critique appropriately for that. The fundamental definition of capitalism is about who owns what, right? It's about the private ownership of the means of production. In socialism or communism, the workers, the collective owns the means of production. They decide what gets made, how it gets made. In capitalism, it's private ownership. That private ownership theory and philosophy is what the hyper individualism of America is feeding, right? So that their welfare state, for instance, ending the collective. What I earn through my capitalist ownership is mine, and I get to decide what to do with
Mm-hmm.
it. I don't want to give it to the
Mm-hmm.
government to share. And ultimately, when you value that profit over everything else, then you start making decisions like it's cheaper to have the labor in a foreign country make my product and ship it over here, regardless of the value of the jobs provide to a community or valuing the workers, their labor, how they feed their families. It's the same reason why American profits have increased, but wages are still so low, right? That money is being sucked out somewhere. It's just not going to the
Yeah.
people. And if you had a
So
communal view, you wouldn't pay the CEO 300 times what the lowest paid worker makes, right? Like, not even, I'm not even saying that if the business was socialist or community owned. I'm just saying if you had a community view about the values of everybody in that business, you pay people more
yeah, but
because you can afford it.
now at the end of the day, like, and I think not to debate the merits, because you're talking Adam Smith capitalism versus Milton Friedman capitalism, right? Like, capitalism is a system that is perpetuated in a direction by values, by the interaction of individuals with the people that are around them. And what we are experiencing now in capitalism is that hyper individualistic capitalist state versus the pensions or the old way under Adam Smith that companies were there to take care of the people that built their products, not just to the shareholders. Whereas Milton Friedman is a shift. Your responsibility is to the shareholders and the people that are investing in your company. And that is just, I think, an example of the shift that we I would like to see made in our collective society that doesn't diminish individualism, but it also sees individualism for what it is as a part of a community, not just as a part of myself.
And also the reality that we have to live in and deal with structurally and
Yeah.
policy-wise is the
Yeah.
fact that Alan Greenspan, as we mentioned in the first episode, who was the Fed chairman for 20 years almost in
Yeah.
America, is an acolyte of Ayn Rand's philosophy
Yeah.
of this rugged individualism, hyper-individualist, and then Reagan put these policies in place. It's part of why we see ourselves as this. It's part of why there was,
That's
I
right.
forget the writer, but he termed us always seeing ourselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. But that's a hyper-individualistic thing to do because we don't even think about the wealth we have collectively and what that could do to raise everybody up. We're just focused on the I, me, mine,
Yeah.
right?
And at the end of the day, like it comes back to the what can we do is as and it's an individual solution to a collective problem, but it starts with how we see ourselves, what we accept and how we work with others, how we build our own community from the outside in and the inside out. It is a hard thing to do. It requires commitment, it requires frustration. It is not going to be a shift overnight. But I think, we'll all be happier for it. We'll all be like happy. The number one predictor of happiness is social connection. Harvard
Listen,
did that 85-year study, right? Like it is the single dominant predictor of happiness is your ability to get to connect and build relationships with others and not
I
just
agree
your
with
family.
that. And I also want to say that's what we do here on the More in Common podcast. Hard questions, no easy answers. Sit in the discomfort as you think through it because that's what we do. That's what this is
Yeah.
for.
Yeah.
Like the show, leave us a comment on YouTube. Make sure you check out this whole 3-episode arc. And honestly, this whole arc that we've been doing when we did Trust Collapse, The Cost of Being Right, Identity Before Argument, the stories we tell about other people, all of these are connected in the throughput about how human connection breaks down, especially in America, institutionally, personally, cognitively, narratively, and structurally. And this is the close of this 3-episode arc about the cost of independence. Keith, it's been really fun. This has been great.
This has been fun. This one almost went an hour. Good,
Yeah.
good close. Good close.
Well, thanks everybody for joining us. We love having you here, and we'll see you next week.
Next week.